I've been flying helicopters for going on 31 years. Search and rescue, medevac, aerial survey work, and for the last 12 years before I retired, contract work for the Forest Service out of a small regional operation based in northern Minnesota. I've logged more hours over wilderness than most people spend in their cars in a lifetime. I know what the land looks like from 300 feet. I know what moves and what doesn't, what belongs and what doesn't. That's what makes this so hard to talk about, because what I saw that morning didn't belong to any category I'd ever been trained to recognize, and I've spent 4 years now trying to convince myself there's an explanation I just haven't thought of yet. I'm not telling this story for attention. I'm 62 years old. I'm retired, and I have nothing to prove to anyone. I'm telling it because it's been sitting in me like something lodged in bone, and I've reached the point where carrying it quietly has become more exhausting than the alternative. My wife knows some of it. My son knows none of it. The people I flew with for 3 decades know only that I retired a little earlier than expected and that I stopped taking contract calls the same week I put in my paperwork. None of them asked why. I think some of them understood, in the way that people who spend their careers over wilderness develop a kind of unspoken tolerance for the things that don't get written into official reports. It was early October, 4 years ago. I was on a routine contract flight, a dawn survey pass over a remote section of national forest in the northern part of the state, well above the lake country, where the trees go on for miles without a road or a structure to break them up. The assignment was straightforward: standard land use monitoring, checking for unauthorized activity, logging disturbance, fire risk indicators. I'd done the same route or one like it dozens of times. The weather was clear and cold, maybe 28 degrees at altitude when I lifted off just before first light. By the time I reached the survey corridor, the sun was coming up low and flat over the canopy, the kind of October light that makes everything look like it's under amber glass. I was flying at roughly 250 feet, moving slowly, making my visual passes the way the contract required. The forest below was dense, mostly mature spruce and birch, the canopy thick enough that you couldn't see the ground directly in most places. But there were natural clearings here and there, old wetland margins, places where the trees thinned out along ridgelines, and those were what I paid attention to. Open ground tells you things closed canopy doesn't. I'd learned that early in my career, and it had served me well through years of search and rescue work, finding people in terrain that looked from above like a solid green ceiling. The morning had been quiet and unremarkable up to that point. I'd documented a few areas of possible illegal road cutting along a ridge to the northwest, photographed some erosion along a creek bed that the resource team would want to look at, and made my standard notes on timber condition in 2 of the survey blocks. Routine work. The kind of methodical, careful observation that becomes second nature after enough years in the air. I was comfortable. I was alert but not tense. The sky was clear and the visibility was exceptional, one of those October mornings in the north where the air feels like it's been rinsed clean overnight. About 40 minutes into the survey, I came over a long, narrow clearing that ran along the edge of a ridge. It was maybe 200 yards from end to end, and perhaps 60 feet wide at its broadest point. I'd passed over it before on previous flights. It was unremarkable, a low scrub area with some standing deadwood along the eastern edge, the kind of opening that forms when a ridge gets enough wind exposure to keep the trees from establishing properly. I throttled back slightly and dropped to about 200 feet to get a better look at what appeared to be some disturbance in the scrub near the western margin of the clearing. I thought it might be evidence of vehicle intrusion, tire tracks, or trampled vegetation, which was part of what I was supposed to document. That's when I saw it. At first, I processed it as 2 things: a large animal and something being dragged. That was the rational first pass my brain made in the second or 2 before the image resolved into something I still don't have adequate language for. What I was seeing was a single figure, upright, moving on 2 legs across the far end of the clearing, and it was carrying something over its shoulder, something large, something with the unmistakable shape and dead weight of a human body. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded even as I was watching it. But I also had 31 years of aerial observation behind me, and I knew the difference between a bear dragging a carcass and something walking upright with a load balanced across its back. This was the latter. The weight distribution was wrong for anything I'd ever seen from the air. The movement had control behind it, the kind of deliberate compensating stride you see in a person carrying something awkward and heavy, someone who knows how to manage a load in motion. The figure was massive. Even from altitude, the scale was wrong in a way that registered immediately and refused to be rationalized away. I've seen bears from the air. I've seen moose standing in clearings. I know how large animals look against open ground when you have reference points for scale. This was taller than anything it should have been, and it was moving with a kind of purposeful, forward-leaning stride that put me in mind of someone who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. It covered the ground quickly despite the load, moving toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing with a confidence that unsettled me before I even fully understood what I was looking at. I banked hard and came around for a second pass. I had maybe 12 seconds of clear observation on that second approach before the tree canopy swallowed the figure completely. In those 12 seconds, I got closer, down to roughly 180 feet above the ground, and I saw enough to understand that I was not going to be able to explain this away before the end of my shift or at any point in the years that followed. The figure moved on two legs. The proportions were wrong for a human being in ways that became more obvious the closer I got. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long, hanging with a heaviness that suggested mass well beyond anything human. The head, which was turned partly away from me as the figure moved toward the trees, was the wrong shape entirely. There was fur, or something that read from altitude as fur, dark and thick, covering the entire body without interruption. And what it was carrying, draped over one shoulder with the stillness of dead weight, was wearing clothing. I could see fabric clearly, light-colored fabric, the kind a hiker or a camper might wear. There was no movement in it. Whatever was being carried was not moving on its own. Then the trees closed over both of them, and the clearing was empty. I came around a third time and held a low hover as long as I safely could, scanning the tree line from one end to the other, looking for any sign of movement in the canopy, any disturbance in the branches that might tell me which direction the figure had gone. There was nothing. The clearing was still. The forest was still. Whatever had crossed that open ground had moved into the trees and disappeared as completely as if it had never been there, as if the land had simply absorbed it. I sat up there at 200 feet for probably 2 full minutes, holding position over the clearing, the rotors hammering their familiar rhythm above me, while everything else went quiet in a way I'd never experienced in the air. My hands were steady. That much I'll say for 31 years of stick time. My hands were steady on the controls, but everything behind them was in a kind of controlled freefall that I'd never felt before. Not in medevac work, not in the worst weather I'd ever flown in, not in any of the difficult moments my career had handed me up to that point. I finally keyed the radio and made a report to dispatch. As calm as I could manage, measured and professional, I told them I had a possible visual on a subject in distress in the survey corridor, gave my GPS coordinates, and requested a ground unit for a welfare check. I did not say what I had actually seen. I did not say I had watched something that looked like no animal in any field guide carry what appeared to be a human body across a forest clearing at dawn. I didn't know how to say that in a way that would produce anything useful, and some part of me that was still operating on professional instinct understood that the moment I said it, everything that followed would be about managing my credibility rather than finding whatever had been in that clearing. Ground units responded, eventually. It took the better part of 2 hours to get personnel into that corridor by road. By that time, I had identified a suitable landing area about a quarter mile from the clearing, set down, shut the engine off, and sat with my thoughts in a silence that felt heavier than any silence I could remember. The forest around the landing area was dense and dark despite the morning sun, the kind of old-growth spruce that blocks light even in October when half the leaves are down. I sat in the cockpit for a while before I got out. I want to be honest about that. I sat in the cockpit and I looked at the tree line and I thought about what I had seen, and I did not immediately get out of the aircraft. When I finally did, I walked the edge of the clearing where the figure had entered the trees. The ground along that margin was soft, still holding moisture from a rain 2 days prior, and there were impressions in it. Not clear enough to photograph with any confidence, not defined enough to call tracks in any way that would mean something to someone who hadn't been watching what I watched from the air, but impressions nonetheless. Deep ones, spaced in a way that suggested a very long stride and something with real weight behind each step. I crouched beside the clearest of them and stayed there for a long moment, not touching anything, just looking. Then I stood up and looked into the trees, into the darkness between the trunks where the morning light hadn't reached, and I made the deliberate and considered decision not to follow. That decision did not feel like cowardice. It felt like the first entirely rational thing I had done since banking into that second pass over the clearing. The ground crew found nothing that met their threshold for documentation. 2 rangers and a wildlife officer worked the area for about 90 minutes, while I stood at the edge of the clearing and answered their questions as carefully as I could without saying the thing I actually needed to say. They were professional and thorough, and I could tell that the younger of the 2 rangers was genuinely troubled by something he wasn't naming either. He kept coming back to the impressions along the tree line, crouching beside them, measuring the spacing with his eyes the way someone does when the numbers aren't adding up. At one point he looked up at me from where he was crouched and started to say something, then seemed to think better of it and stood up and walked to the next impression without finishing the thought. I've thought about that moment many times since. I've wondered what he was going to say and whether he'd seen something out here before that had taught him the value of not finishing certain sentences out loud in the presence of colleagues, where words become part of a record whether you intend them to or not. The wildlife officer's conclusion was bare, stated with the kind of flat professional certainty that closes conversations rather than opens them. He said it while he was still writing in his notebook, not looking up, the way a person says something they've already decided before arriving at the scene. I didn't argue. I had no standing to argue, nothing in my hands that would have changed his assessment, and some functional part of my professional instinct understood that the moment I pushed back with what I'd actually seen from the air, the conversation would stop being about the clearing and start being about me. I nodded and made the appropriate sounds and watched them pack up their gear and head back toward the service road through the trees. The younger ranger was the last to leave. He paused at the edge of the clearing, just at the tree line, and looked back at me with an expression that I still think about. It wasn't skepticism and it wasn't pity. It was something quieter than either of those things, something that looked, from where I was standing, a lot like recognition. Then he turned and followed the others into the forest, and I was alone in that clearing with the low October sun pressing through the spruce and the sound of the wind working the upper canopy and the thing I had seen still sitting behind my eyes with no good place to put it. I stood there for a while after they left, longer than I needed to. The clearing was roughly 200 yards long, and I walked the length of it slowly, staying near the center, keeping distance from the tree line on both sides in a way that I didn't examine too closely at the time. The scrub vegetation was undisturbed through most of the clearing. Whatever had crossed it had moved along the far margin, close to the western tree line, and that was where the impressions were concentrated, such as they were. I went back to them one more time before I returned to the aircraft. I crouched beside the deepest one and looked at it for a long time without touching it. The shape was ambiguous enough that I understood why the wildlife officer had written what he'd written. But the depth was not ambiguous, and the spacing was not ambiguous, and the way they tracked in a straight, purposeful line directly toward the eastern tree line was not ambiguous. Something heavy had moved through here with intention, something that knew where it was going. I flew 3 more contract assignments after that before I put in my retirement paperwork. Each one took me over remote forest at low altitude, the same kind of work I'd been doing for years, and each one was different in a way that had nothing to do with the terrain or the weather or the specific assignment. What changed was the way I looked at the canopy. Before that October morning, I had looked at closed tree cover as an obstacle to observation, something to see around and through, a problem of visibility to be managed by altitude and angle and patience. After that morning, I understood it differently. I understood it as concealment, as the permanent condition of the land beneath a forest canopy, where the ratio of what can be seen from above to what cannot is not something you can improve past a certain point, no matter how low you fly or how good your visibility is. I had been flying over that forest for 12 years, with the assumption that my altitude gave me a reasonably complete picture of what moved through it. That assumption did not survive the fall. Each of those 3 remaining flights, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done before, which was scanning the clearings with a different kind of attention. Not the professional, methodical attention of a land use surveyor looking for evidence of specific human activity, but something older than that, something that operated below the level of training and technique. I was looking for the thing I had seen, or looking to confirm that it wasn't there. I'm not entirely sure which, and I don't think the distinction matters as much as the fact that I was doing it at all, that the behavior had changed, that the sky above the forest no longer felt like the neutral, elevated vantage point I had spent 3 decades believing it was. I retired in December of that year. I told my wife I was ready, that 31 years was enough, that my knees were giving me real trouble, and I wanted to be home more before the grandchildren got to the age where they stopped wanting that. All of that was true. None of it was the reason, and she knew it wasn't the reason, and she had the particular grace not to press me on it in those first months when I was still working out what I was going to do with what I knew. In the spring after I retired, I did something I hadn't expected to do, which was research. I'm not someone who spends much time reading things on the internet, and I came to it without any framework for what I was looking for, or what I expected to find. But I had been a methodical observer my whole professional life, and I approached it the same way I had approached every difficult technical problem my career had handed me, which was systematically, without deciding in advance what the conclusion was going to be. I read accounts from Minnesota, from Wisconsin, from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, from the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest. Witnesses describing something large and bipedal in remote woodland, moving with a speed and a purposefulness that the witnesses consistently had difficulty reconciling with any animal they knew. I read accounts from hunters and from hikers, and from people who worked in the woods for a living and knew the difference between what they were describing and the things those woods were supposed to contain. What I looked for in those accounts was the same thing I looked for in weather data before a difficult flight, which was pattern. The signal underneath the individual data points, the thing that the aggregate was telling me that no single entry was capable of telling me on its own. And the pattern was there, more consistent than I was prepared for, more specific than folklore or imagination tends to produce when left to its own devices: the size, the dark fur, the upright gait described with the same mechanical language across accounts that had no connection to each other, the same observations about the way weight was distributed, the way the stride covered ground. The eyes, when witnesses got close enough to see them, described again and again with that same quality of awareness, that same quality of something looking back that registered not as animal reaction, but as assessment, recognition, the sense that whatever was on the other side of the encounter understood the situation at least as well as the person describing it. I read those accounts the way I had once read accident reports from other pilots, not looking for validation of what I already believed, but looking for the honest shape of what had actually happened, stripped of the interpretation and the self-protection that people layer over difficult experiences when they talk about them out loud. And the honest shape of what I found was this. Whatever I had seen from 180 feet above that ridge clearing in northern Minnesota on an October morning, I had not been the first person to see something like it, and I would not be the last, and the people who had seen it before me had largely done the same thing I had done, which was carry it quietly, and find that carrying it quietly was its own kind of weight. What I keep coming back to, even now, is the carrying itself. The deliberate, load-managed, forward-leaning act of transporting something across open ground. I've spent 4 years attempting to construct an alternative explanation for that specific detail, approaching it from different angles the way you circle a problem you can't land on directly, and I have not been able to build one that holds. A bear does not carry. It drags. And the mechanics of dragging look nothing like what I observed from the air. A wolf does not carry prey upright across open ground on 2 legs. Nothing in the documented wildlife of northern Minnesota moves the way that figure moved, with that distribution of weight, with that stride length, with that particular forward lean of something managing a heavy and awkward load with practiced familiarity. The mechanics of the observation do not fit any animal I was trained to identify from the air. and I was trained by people who understood that misidentification at altitude had real consequences, and I had 31 years of practice behind that training. There were 2 hikers reported missing from the national forest that fall. I learned about it several weeks after my flight through a mention in passing from someone at the operations office, the way you hear about things that are local and unresolved and haven't risen to the level of news outside the county. 2 men, longtime friends, experienced in the backcountry, who had gone into the forest for a long weekend in late September and had not come out on the other side of it. Search teams had worked the area extensively. The official finding was that they had likely become disoriented in deteriorating conditions and succumbed to exposure, their remains subsequently dispersed by scavengers before searchers could locate them. That was the official finding. I sat with that information for a long time before I arrived at anything I could honestly call a position on it, and what I arrived at was that I did not know with certainty what had happened to those 2 men, and that the honest acknowledgement of that uncertainty was probably the most I could offer. But I know what I saw on the morning of the 4th of October, 4 years ago, and I know the date of their entry into the forest, and I know the geography, and I have not found a way to hold all 3 of those things in mind at the same time without it costing me something. I don't go into the backcountry anymore. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I live at the edge of a small town in the northern part of the state, and there is forest behind my property, mature spruce and birch that runs for miles without interruption, and in the mornings I sit on the back porch with coffee and I look at it. I look at it with something that I think is closer to honesty now than what I felt before that October morning, which was a kind of comfortable familiarity that I had mistaken for understanding. The forest behind my house is the same forest it always was. What changed is my sense of how much of it I can actually see and what that implies about how much of it I cannot. I'm not afraid in a way that prevents me from living. I want to say that clearly. I sleep reasonably well. I function. I'm present with my family in the ways that matter. But there is something that has not returned to its prior position since that morning, some calibration in the way I relate to wild and remote places, and I have come to believe that the recalibration is probably appropriate rather than a symptom of something that needs correcting. I was wrong about what the forest contained. Being wrong about something that significant tends to leave a mark, and I think the mark is the honest response to the error rather than something to be treated or talked away. I don't know what I saw. I want to finish with that same precision I started with, because it was my profession, and I owe it the same honesty I gave every flight report I ever filed. I know the size, I know the gait and the weight distribution and the purposefulness of the movement. I know the proportions were wrong for anything in my training or my experience. I know what was being carried appeared to be human and was not moving under its own power. I know the forest took both of them in the space of 12 seconds and returned nothing. Those are the facts, as I observed them from 180 feet above a ridge clearing in northern Minnesota on a clear October morning with 31 years of aerial observation behind my eyes. What those facts add up to, I leave to whoever is listening. I've made a certain peace with not arriving at a conclusion. What I have not made peace with, and what I expect I will carry for whatever years remain to me, is the image of that clearing going still, the trees standing at their edge, indifferent and unmoved, and the particular quality of the silence that followed, which was not the silence of a forest undisturbed, but the silence of a forest that had just finished doing something and was waiting with what felt very much like patience to see if anyone had noticed.